Mr. Archibald in class. For a long time, fishermen have had the privilege to many years of work to the supply of fish in the oceans, lakes, and rivers of Canada. They thought that fish were a renewable resource, but were proven wrong. The collapse of the fisheries during the 1990s changed it all. The supply of fish on the east and west coast declined to the point that businesses and fisheries were forced to shut down. Ocean fishing is Canada's oldest industry, which began in the early 1500s. Commercial fishing is the basis for a traditional way of life that has a special place in Canada's cultural heritage. Commercial fishing occurs on the east coast, the west, and in large freshwater lakes.
East Coast Fishery. Oceans off the east coast of Canada used to be one of the world's greatest fishing areas. A lot of factors made waters extremely advisable for fish. The main factor contributing to this water suitable for fish is the sunlight. Sunlight hits the seafloor, which causes an abundant supply of plankton that appeals towards the large amount of fish. The most known fishing region off the east coast of Canada is the Grand Banks. For connection, the island of Newfoundland is 11,400 kilometers squared, and the Grand Banks is 280,000 kilometers squared. The two ocean currents meeting, the cold Labrador Current and the warm Gulf Stream, contributed to the natural environment for the fishes. The reason for this is because when the two ocean currents meet, they gathered a lot of nutrients that floated to the top, which the plankton ate, then the fish ate the plankton that were rich with natural nutrients. As stated before, the East Coast used to be one of the world's greatest fishing areas for centuries. It is centralized to two different types of fisheries, inshore fisheries and offshore fisheries. The main difference between the two is the depth of the water. Inshore fishing is within kilometers of the shore, whereas offshore fishing is in a deep water. However, there are more differences such as the boats, the weather, fuel and supplies, equipment, and the variety of the size of fish.
Crisis in the East Coast fishery. Fishermen in the East Coast noticed that they were catching smaller and less fish in the 1980s. The specific type of fish that seemed to be disappearing most was the northern cod off Newfoundland and southern Labrador. The amount of cod decreased in 1978 to 1979. However, the decline in 1991 was unexpected and a lot more significant. In 1992, the Canadian government reacted by disallowing all fishing for northern cod and by limiting the total catch allowed for other species to be fished. After the ban for the catching of groundfish was imposed, scientists, governments, and the fishing industry expected that fish populations would recover in 5 to 7 years. However, this has not occurred. The amount of cod is not only at the same amount as it was in 1992, but some people fear that the species might never recover. Fishermen are catching large amounts of other types of fish, shellfish in particular. Fishery critics believe that fishermen might have not learned their lessons and might be overfishing these species of fish.
West Coast fishery. In the West Coast fishery, there are 5 different kinds of salmon. The 5 types are coho, chum, pink, spring, and sockeye, which is considered the most valuable type of salmon of the 5. Even though salmon is found on the East Coast as well, the West Coast catch has commonly been over 400 times larger than the East Coast catch. Challenges to the West Coast fishery. Since the amount of salmon is decreasing, there is the trouble of stabilizing a restricted amount of fish with a growing requirement. There are 3 requirements for salmon in British Columbia: commercial fishing, sport fishing, and fishing by the First Nations. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the commercial fleet caught 94% of the salmon, while each of the other groups regarded for around 3%. First Nations. The appeal for salmon by Aboriginal people is increasing for 2 reasons. First, a decision was made by the Supreme Court in 1990, approved the right of the First Nations to fish for their own food as well as for communal and ritual reasons. The court settled that this use takes first in order over all other considerations except conservation. Second, the right to fish commercially is a target of many First Nations land claims in British Columbia. Sport fishing. The sport fishing business also wants a larger share of the salmon that is vacant. The argument is economic. A salmon caught by a competitive angler brings in a much better economic advantage than a salmon caught by a commercial fishing boat. Commercial fishing. If the First Nations and the sport fishing business are to receive better shares of the fish, and the government is to guarantee an acceptable breeding stock, commercial fishers will have to cut down their catch. The federal government is helping with this reduction by constantly acquiring commercial fishing licenses and fishing boats so that the amount of commercial fishers is decreased.
Collapse to the West Coast fishery. After the collapse of the West Coast fishery, many people felt the need to change how they managed fishing in the West Coast. There were many reasons of why there was a partial collapse in the West Coast fisheries. Overfishing. Especially during the 1990s, overfishing was a big problem. Over 800,000 tons of fish were caught on the West Coast. Considering this large amount, not many fish reached the spawning rivers, so the population decreased. Changes in the environment. Global warming has caused an increase in temperature in the Pacific Ocean, which might destroy the salmon's habitat. Salmon are able to live in water that is below 7 degrees Celsius. Global warming has caused the temperature to increase above that. If the water continues to warm, salmon will be forced to go further north to Alaska instead of British Columbia, and Canada will lose its West Coast fisheries because of this. Lack of salmon fishing treaty. There is an ongoing dispute between the United States and Canada about the number of fish that are allowed to be caught on the West Coast. Canada officials think that less salmon should be allowed to be caught, while United States officials believe there should be no restrictions at all. This dispute has caused the resource of fishing in the West Coast to decrease and possibly disappear.
The freshwater fishery. Canada's freshwater fisheries are located in the Great Lakes, Great Slave Lake, Lake Winnipeg, and approximately 600 or so smaller lakes. The Great Lakes have the most important and reliable supply of freshwater fishery, with Lake Erie as the largest producer of fish today. The primary species of fish sent to markets and stores from these lakes are whitefish, pickerel, perch, and trout. The freshwater fisheries are less important to the Canadian economy and are a notch under compared to those of the East or West Coast. The majority of fish are taken from the East and West Coast fisheries, as only 4% of the total value of the Canadian fishery comes from inland waters. Only about 7,000 people have jobs in the freshwater fishery. Even though these numbers are small, the freshwater fishery is a very important industry to the areas of where it takes place. Sport fishing in freshwater lakes and rivers are more important economically than commercial fishing. Each year, billions of dollars are spent on things like fishing equipment and bait, fishing boats, and even fishing magazines.
Aquaculture is known as aquafarming. It is controlled farming of water animals such as fish and aquatic plants. The reason it is done is because it is more efficient to do. You don't need as many boats, and it's more reliable. Sometimes fish can be more toxic as the fish are given parts of other fishes who have toxics.
In conclusion, unfortunately, the fishing business in Canada is in a critical situation. The East Coast fish have been overfished, similar to the West Coast, where many different companies and countries are all fishing for the same fish with a limited amount. Canada needs changes to keep jobs and continue our tradition for fishing.